25 years ago.
Wouldn't believe it, would you? Look at us now.
No.
Fans of the classic 1988 movie Willow are abuzz at the release of the new series, which is set years after the events in the movie. But regardless of how much we like the new one, the film is still the OG.
Thank you very much, thank you.
If you're a Willow head, a name I totally just made up, then stick around, because we're revealing a bunch of facts you never knew about the movie Willow. If you focus only on Joanne Whalley, who played Saoirse, during the fight scenes, you'll probably be slightly amused. Because while she's an excellent actress and nailed the role, she's not so much great with the fighting and the battling. And editing can only do so much. Whalley occasionally looks like she's been forced to pick a sword that's a little too heavy and execute moves that are a little beyond her training. But hey, maybe that's perfect for the plot. Maybe Queen Bavmorda took her powers for granted and never bothered to teach Saoirse how to properly fight.
Stop saying that!
But honestly, I'm being a little too harsh. Maybe it's because I know that Joanne Whalley had a bit of an extracurricular oopsie on set. Namely, she accidentally stabbed someone. Not a great look for anyone trying to win over the cast and crew. The incident happened when they were filming a scene in which Saoirse dramatically drives her sword into the ground, outside the tavern where Willow, Madmartigan, and baby Alora are hiding. And let's just say, Whalley got it half right. She definitely took her sword and jammed it with ferocity in a downwards motion. But the part about not actually stabbing someone, that's the part she really could have improved on. Her blade went directly into a stuntman's foot. Reportedly, he was so in character he shouted, "Thank you, m'lady!" Okay, I'm completely making that last part up. I'm guessing he shouted more curse words than we could even bleep out in time in this video. George Lucas, as you're probably aware, has a loose affiliation with the Star Wars franchise. While filming Return of the Jedi, he took a liking to the actor who played an Ewok named Wicket. Wicket took the lead in making friends with Leia and the gang when they arrived on Endor. The part was played adeptly by Warwick Davis. It was far from a leading role in Jedi, but Davis made quite the impression on Lucas. So much so that when he began creating the story for Willow, he wrote it completely with Warwick in mind for the lead character. When it came time to cast the film, Lucas wouldn't even allow suggestions to cast anyone else. He had his mind set on Davis. Lucas even admitted later that Willow's personality was written to perfectly match Davis's, which is why Willow is upbeat and good-hearted. With all this in mind, you'd assume that Davis would have gotten top billing, right? After all, Hollywood bigwig George Lucas writes a movie with you in mind and molds that character to be like you in real life. That feels like #1 on the call sheet territory to me, and yet Val Kilmer was given top billing. Obviously, Val was a bigger star than Warwick, whose biggest role to date consisted of him in a furry mask speaking gibberish to Luke Skywalker. But still, Warwick Davis is in pretty much every scene of the movie, and oh right, it's named after his character. So Lucas was understandably upset when the marketing folks for the movie informed him that Val was getting top billing.
I still got what counts.
I'm not sure what it sounds like when George Lucas gets angry, but I'm assuming it's a lot of threatening to make another movie with Jar Jar Binks. Dennis Muren might not be a name you're super familiar with unless you're his parents, and I happen to know they are big fans of Screen Rant. Hi, Mr. and Mrs. Muren. Anyway, Muren was the visual effects supervisor for Willow, which is a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself. But Muren and his team of effects wizards at Industrial Light and Magic managed to not only deliver a killer product, they managed to invent an FX process that completely revolutionized the industry, NBD. Specifically, they came up with digital morphing, an effect that's been used countless times since 1988. There's a series of shots where the character of Finn Raziel is transformed into various animals, before finally transforming into her real human self. She begins as a sort of tree shrew before becoming a series of larger animals, including a crow, a goat, and a tiger. In previous years, this would have been done with the use of practical effects, trickery with cutaways, and other editing techniques. The crew would have had mechanical props in place, say a creature's ears starting to pop out, and then crank the gears to have them move. Right before then, it would cut to another character watching it happen to allow for the crew to get into position. It was clunky, to say the least, and quite limiting. Perhaps worst of all, it forced the editor to make decisions that helped out the effects and not the story. There was also the option of stop-motion animation, but that was time-consuming and not always super realistic looking. So Muren and crew set out to find a new way. They developed techniques using digital morphing to allow the transitions from animal to take place without affecting the edit.
He said, I think we can merge them. And I said, what do you mean like a dissolve?
Of course, by today's standards, it looks adorably quaint. But at the time, it was pretty baller, and it paved the way for so many of the CGI effects you see all the time today. Okay, bye Mr. and Mrs. Mirren. The effects weren't the only remarkable first that Willow achieved. In an interview, Warwick Davis pointed out that Willow required a large number of little people to fill out all the roles of the Nelwynts. And according to the records kept by the casting agency, there were somewhere in the range of 225 to 240 little people who were on set for filming, which set a record for the most little people cast of any movie. And a decent amount were given lines and got some nice screen time. Certainly not all 240 people, because that would probably have made it a 6-hour movie. The ones who didn't get much screen time or many lines were still vital to establish the village of the Nelwynts from where Willow hailed. It was an incredibly important step in the movement towards more representation, not only for little people, but for people of all kinds who have traditionally only been cast in limited amounts or as extras. Throughout the film, Willow and the gang get chased by creatures known charmingly as death dogs. They belong to the evil Queen Bavmorda and are frankly kinda mean. Early on in the film, they totally kill a nice old midwife simply for protecting Allura. Of course, can you blame a creature called a death dog for that kind of behavior? Regardless, these days those canines would likely be completely CGI territory, but the costume and art department on Willow decided to go old school with it, which meant they used real dogs and just popped rubber masks on them. When they needed close-up shots of the death dogs, which looked basically like half pigs, half dogs, they used animatronic heads. But most of the shots of the dogs were usually not close-ups, so you mostly saw a weird version of Dog Halloween throughout the film. Not only were the actors real dogs, but they were puppies. The crew knew the natural exuberance of the puppies would fit the energy of the death dogs, and according to the folks who worked on the movie, the dogs were actually having the time of their lives. They got to sprint around a ton, get fed treats at every break, and went to the bathroom wherever they wanted. And yes, that last one is an educated guess on my part. If you're a stickler for counting, and who among us isn't, you may have noticed that while Willow is gifted 3 magic acorns, he only uses 2 in the movie, and yet somehow he's fully out when he throws his second one at the end. But not to worry, this wasn't a case of miscounting by the writing and editing team.
No.
Which is a relief. It wouldn't be a great look to get confused by counting to 3. It turns out there was a scene filmed that explained what happened to the real second acorn. Warwick Davis was interviewed on the Empire podcast, and they asked about this supposed continuity error. He admitted there was a scene cut from the film that would have accounted for the lost acorn. Apparently, they shot a scene where Willow tries to use the magic acorn, which, in case you don't remember, turns whatever it hits into stone, while on a boat. He unfortunately turns the boat to stone by accident, which I'm assuming causes it to sink. Davis even pointed out he had wet hair in the next scene to account for having been in the water after the boat sank. But since they cut the part where the boat turns to stone, the continuity error is now the fact that Willow suddenly has wet hair for no reason. So you continuity sticklers can rest easy, or rest frantic, or whatever. Because there's still a continuity issue you can rant about, it's just not the acorns. Leave the acorns alone. You've probably heard about the lengths many actors will go to get authentic-looking footage of dangerous stunts. Actors like Tom Cruise and Jackie Chan are famous for doing their own stunts despite the significant dangers involved. Which makes me wonder, why haven't we seen a Tom Cruise-Jackie Chan two-hander yet? I would definitely pay to see a movie about 2 movie stars stuck in a hospital with broken legs after refusing to hire stuntmen. I digress. I'm not sure where Val Kilmer falls on the spectrum of actors when it comes to insisting they do their own stunts. It's entirely possible that on Willow, he left it to the professionals and focused on being staggeringly handsome and spitting out cool one-liners. But he did manage to get hurt while on set. You might imagine it was either from a sword fighting scene, or when he was rolling down a snowy mountain, or running at full speed through rocks. You'd be wrong. Our first introduction to Kilmer's character, Madmartigan, comes when he's trapped inside a huge bird cage left to die. Eventually he gets released and goes on to impressive things like pretending to be a woman, falling in love via golden dust, more on that later, and generally saying rude things as he swashbuckles around. However, after the director yelled "cut" on one take, Kilmer jumped out of the prop cage. As he did, the chain on the cage broke, and the whole thing came crashing down on his foot. It wasn't a major injury, but it did cause him to have a noticeable limp for a while. What's unfortunate is that they didn't film this scene on the final day of shooting. Kilmer ended up having a limp for the next few days. So there are scenes when you can clearly see him hobbling a little. But he's also so attractive you might not have noticed. It's easy to go off on movies and TV shows from earlier eras through modern-day lenses and find fault with them. In the MeToo era, art from days gone by can be pretty cringeworthy to look back on. such is the fate of some elements of Willow. There are some pretty important plot points that rely on some, let's just say, pervy elements. It revolves around what's known as the Dust of Broken Heart. The tiny brownie characters have it in a satchel, and it basically serves as a love potion. Anyone who inhales it automatically becomes smitten with the next person, or as it turns out, living thing, they come across. At first, it's used in a silly way, where the brownie called Rule accidentally inhales the dust and falls in love with a stray cat. A weird choice, but fairly harmless. But later on, Madmartigan inhales it and falls deeply in love with Sorsha after sneaking into her tent as she sleeps. He essentially pulls a trifecta of no-nos, entering a woman's room without permission, crawling into bed with her while she sleeps, and trying to make out with her. The whole thing is pretty suspect, not to mention having a major plot point revolving around someone being slipped a drug that makes them act horny. Admittedly, the whole thing was played for comedic effect, but it's the type of comedy that wouldn't stand up these days. While there are some issues that seriously date the movie, ranging from the effects to the MeToo problems we just discussed, there are other ways in which Willow was ahead of its time. We already talked about the fact that it had the most little people in it of any movie, but it was also impressive in the way it treated the ending scenes and the characters who decide the fate of the story. It manages to buck the trends of most fantasy and hero stories by having the characters with the most agency at the end be people other than the rugged and handsome sword fighter. The big fight scene at the end features 3 people who you might not expect to see dueling it out. 2 older women, the dueling Queen Bavmorda and the now human-formed sorceress Fenrisiel, as well as a little person, Willow, bring the movie to a climax. And while Madmartigan and the handful of other warriors we've gotten familiar with are part of the end battle, they aren't the ones who manage to turn things for the good. This method of turning the usual storytelling on its head served the movie well, and it might be one of the big reasons why it stood the test of time. Writers have their own methods when it comes to choosing the names of their characters. And while we don't know how George Lucas chose most of the characters, we do know that he named some of the villains in the movie after movie critics. For starters, General Kale, a monstrous baddie with a skull mask, is named after famous movie critic Pauline Kael. And there's a huge fight scene towards the end with a 2-headed monster that, in the script, is called the Eberisk. It's a portmanteau of the names Siskel and Ebert, 2 other legendary film critics. It's a pretty funny way to rib the critics who are constantly making his life more difficult. Of course, Lucas loses some of the cool points by making Willow's last name Ufgood. At least he didn't name the villain Queen Isbad. It's pretty well known that often actors have to learn a skill for an upcoming movie, but Warwick Davis definitely had his hands full when he signed on to play Willow. He not only had to learn some basic things like how to properly hold a baby, but he also had to see a dialect coach to rid him of his normal accent and learn one to fit the movie. Then he had to get up to speed on how to brandish a sword. And if that wasn't enough, he was expected to learn horseback riding. To top things off, Warwick was also tasked with learning some sleight of hand and close-up magic tricks for the scene in the beginning when he makes a pig disappear. That's a lot to learn for one role, but clearly he's a good student because he pretty much nailed all those tasks. Deleted scenes are pretty common, but it's not that often that a movie spends a ton of time and money shooting a giant sequence only to scrap it. But apparently the production of Willow included a 2-week-long shoot that featured a giant storm sequence. The shoot was apparently pretty difficult, but the cast and crew managed to get through it. The problem was the post-production budget. The powers that be decided it would be too expensive to edit and to put effects on the sequence, so they decided it could go. Fortunately, it wasn't essential for the plot, so it was left on the cutting room floor. However, it was included on the Blu-ray version of the movie that was released not that long ago. So if you're a big Willow fan, you can try to snag one of those once you buy a Blu-ray player. While we know the part of Willow was written specifically for Warwick Davis, the rest of the roles were up for grabs. And as often happens, there were several actors who were close to being cast but didn't end up getting the parts. Perhaps the most notable miss was from none other than John Cusack. He was quite close to being cast as Madmartigan before the part went to Val Kilmer. According to John, the rejection was awful. He's admitted that he still considers not getting that particular part to be the biggest disappointment in his legendary acting career. In an interview, Warwick Davis confirmed that Cusack was indeed quite close to getting the part. John did a screen test for the movie, which meant he was being seriously considered. Davis added that Cusack and his reps were trying everything they could to convince the producers to give him the part. But alas, it wasn't to be. Though Say Anything came out the next year, so clearly John was quickly on his way to mega stardom. Nobody's weeping for the Cuse. So there you have it. More fun facts about Willow than you can shake a weird bendy wand at. Hopefully you've enjoyed this trip down memory lane. And if you're anything like me, you probably will now spend the afternoon watching Willow yet again. Whoops, time to call in sick to work again.